very happy to welcome you on this fifth Agroecology Transect webinar, where Transect stands for Transdisciplinary Approaches for Systemic Economic, Ecological, and Climate Change Transitions. We started in September 2022 for 4 years, meaning that we're just past the midway point. Our global ambition, written on this slide, is laying the groundwork for agroecology as the future of farming in Europe by learning, engaging, and inspiring action. In brief, our aim is to contribute to unfolding the full potential of agroecology for European agriculture by quantifying the potential of agroecology for climate change mitigation and adaptation, for biodiversity conservation in farm ecosystems, and for farm socio-economic resilience. We do so by connecting generic scientific knowledge to local experiential knowledge present in 11 innovation hubs that you see depicted here as the yellow drops. The triangles are the partner organizations in Agroecology Transect. These innovation hubs have all been involved in agroecological transformation processes for more than 4 years. The innovation hubs, content-wise, address grassland-based beef and dairy systems and arable, perennial, and mixed systems, accounting thus for the diversity of agriculture across Europe. Of relevance to today's webinars, 3 innovation hubs focus on grassland-based systems. In Switzerland, the innovation hub focuses on the ecological aspects of producing fodder in a context of high stocking rates. So they focus on the agro-ecosystem level of the Gleesman ladder, the right side of the spider web here on your screen. Then in the Bulgarian Western Stara Planina, the innovation hub has its emphasis on the policy and political sides of high nature value grazing with low stocking rates. So more on the food system side, on the left side in the spider web. And in the French Massif Central, the innovation hub combines ecological and socio-political aspects with moderate stocking rates. And the profiles you see here mapped onto the 13 dimensions of the high-level panel of experts definition of agroecology that I took from a paper that we have as a project under review. Together with the innovation hub facilitators, we co-produce actionable knowledge. By this, we mean locally relevant knowledge that actors can use for action. Such knowledge may be new knowledge, but we have seen various instances where bringing together existing knowledge in new ways can help empower actors to take action. To generate actionable knowledge, we are a consortium with 19 partners from scientific organizations, NGOs, and private consultants in 12 countries. Among the scientists, 50% have a natural sciences background, half come from the social sciences. And contrary to today's lineup, we have an equal share of women and men in the project. We see the unfolding of agroecology in terms of the multi-level perspective to transitions. In this slide of this well-used MLP framework, you see in blue in the center the dominant socio-technical regime, the way we do things. In pink, the niche innovations at the bottom there. And at the top, the socio-technical landscape in green, which exerts pressures on the regime and the niches. At all levels, a felt need for change may then lead to opportunities for these niche innovations to anchor in the regime. And what we do in the project is to use scientific analysis and reflexive innovation strategies to see how this anchoring of the innovation hub niches can be stimulated. The last 2 aspects of the project concern the unlocking of the potential of agroecology through scaling out and scaling up. Scaling out takes us beyond the 11 innovation hubs to analyze at territory level where biophysical and socio-economic conditions are more or less conducive for agroecological production systems. As part of this endeavor, we surveyed 89 agroecological initiatives across Europe, the first 40 of which are represented on this map. For more information on this work, please join us again for one of the next webinars at the end of October, in fact. As for scaling up, we analyze how European projects, how European policy instruments enable or constrain the expansion of agroecology. This part of the project leads us to engage with policymakers and policy recipients at European, national, and territory levels. Switching then to today's program, we will focus on livestock grazing. Within Agroecology Transect, we see agroecology as among the most promising options to alleviate negative impacts of farming on the environment and build local food systems based on ethically acceptable production methods. What do current research insights contribute to support or nuance this vision? Today, we will listen to presentations by Bertrand Dumont and Sebastian Lakner, who consider the value of animal grazing systems for biodiversity and landscape specifically. From different scientific perspectives, they address the same overarching topic that in the announcement of Bertrand's webinar was formulated as, it's not the cow, it's the how. Following their presentations, we expect to have ample time for questions and answers. And together with Anna and Chilak, I will collect and possibly connect questions and remarks that you put in the chat and ask the speakers to respond to them. In that part of the webinar, we can also draw on the knowledge of Dr. Guy Peer, who is a conservation biologist with the German Center for Integrated Biodiversity Research at Leipzig, and deeply involved in the effects of European policies on biodiversity. Now, moving to the first speaker, Dr. Bertrand Dumont. Bertrand is senior researcher at INRAE, based in Clermont-Ferrand in France. He's an animal scientist and an agroecologist, and on top of that, he is the coordinator of Agroecology Transect. Please, Bertrand, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Walter. I hope you can see my first slide. Is it okay?
Yes, it's perfect.
Thank you, Silak. So thank you all for joining. So as Walter mentioned, we will deal with this question of extensified grassland-based system with different perspective, and my perspective will focus on trade-off between production and environmental issues. And in environmental issues, I will deal with the positive effects, which are called services and ecosystem services, but also with the negatives. I will deal with the negatives because it's working. Because I think you all know this, that you see that when we conduct life cycle analysis, producing beef or sheep meat at pasture is considered as the worst option for the planet. But what you can also see on this graph is that you have wide horizontal bars, which shows that the way you produce sheep meat or milk at pasture or beef meat will have a strong impact on the environmental impact. And you can also see that the way you manage your pasture, the way you manage your herds also has an impact on biodiversity. And that's why basically I'm saying that it's not the cow. I would say it's not only the cow, because we have to think on the right dimension of how much meat we consume, but it's not only the cow, it's also the how. When we talk about extensification, we will talk about this at the farm scale level, but we can also present some results at the plots level. There are a number of ecological processes that matter. When cattle or sheep or horses are grazing, they do what is being called patch grazing, which means that they have a preference for the short patches where grass grow again and remains at a high nutritive stage. And by doing this, cattle and horses stabilize patch structure. And we know that having a more heterogeneous structure benefit biodiversity. This is called the habitat heterogeneity hypothesis that can apply at both plot, farm, and also the landscape level. Something else that is crucial is related to the trophic hypothesis. We know that grazing animals in pasture has an effect on grass yield and also on grass structure, but also on flowering intensity. And due to this trophic, in line with this trophic hypothesis, extensive grazing is known to benefit a number of insect taxa, such as grasshopper and butterflies. And also in extensification, limit all the negative direct effects of grazing, like for example, trampling that can destroy the nest of some birds that for which grassland are a key habitat. And grassland-based farming is not only related does not only produce meat, milk, and biodiversity, they also provide a number of ecosystem services to society. Later in this talk, I will mention water quality. I will also mention the aesthetic value of landscape. And I will also mention carbon sequestration in the soil that contributes to climate change mitigation. And I would just like to highlight a recent modeling study that indicates that this carbon sequestration alone in managed grassland cannot compensate for the climate change impact of current ruminant emission, which would call for decreasing the number of ruminants. And I will investigate this question: how much from the carbon emission by cattle herd can be compensated by grassland according to a stocking density? So to do that, I will use 5 farms at the start of this talk. And among these 5 farms, 4 farms are real farms. You can find more detail on this farm in this paper by Émeric Mondière that was published earlier this year in Agricultural Systems. They are all in the Atlantic lowlands, in northwest France and in the south of England. And you see that we have a gradient of stocking density. The conventional farm has a stocking density of 1.3 livestock unit per hectare. And you know that Holstein cows with high genetic merits feed on both temporary pasture and annual fodder crops. And when you decrease stocking density, you move to the 2 agroecological farms. And one farm is part of a network based on the nature, which means that the ambition of biodiversity is higher than in the other agroecological farm. And at the end of this gradient of stocking density, we will use agricultural rewilding, and the Knepp farm is in the south of England. The stocking density is very low, 0.8 in livestock unit per hectare. And you see that the type of cattle is also completely different. And in this farm, animals are using a mosaic of grassland, shrubs, and woody areas. We decided that it makes sense to add a 5th farm, which is not a real farm, it's a model farm. And this 5th farm is used to model, to assess a sustainable intensification option. So what is sustainable intensification? It aims to increase the productivity of agricultural land to limit further loss of undisturbed natural ecosystem. So it means that farmers who would follow this model will try to increase the efficiency of production within the agricultural land. And by doing this, it's a land sparing option, and you can use less land and preserve land for nature. And in this case, this farm was modeled so that it produces the same amount of human edible protein as the agroecological farm, with the same size and productivity of agricultural area as in the conventional farm. And by doing this, we see that only 48 hectares are needed to produce the required amount of protein, while 44 hectares, which is half of the area, is uncultivated and evolved gradually towards climax vegetation, and in the western lowland climax vegetation is broadly forest. So I move now to the results. So you have the 5 farms in the in column, going from the agricultural rewilding on the left to conventional farm on the right. You see that there is a clear gradient of production. Of course, production is much higher in the conventional farm, and gross climate change effect is directly related to methane emissions, and it follows the number of animals and the stocking density. But we have carbon sequestration in the soil when we have permanent grassland, and you have this value, and we also have carbon sequestration in the woody biomass in both the agricultural rewilding farm and in the sustainable intensification farm. In the sustainable intensification, this carbon sequestration occurs in the area that is given back to nature. And at the end, this is the results. You see that the conventional farm is producing more, but also is a source of carbon, a source of methane emissions. The agricultural rewilding is not producing a lot, but it's a clear carbon sink. And we have 2 options that are climate neutral, but with different options. We have a low land sharing option in the Paysan de Nature farm, but this compensation occurs at a low stocking density, only 0.53 livestock unit per hectare. And with a land sparing option in the sustainable intensification farm, you have growing trees that compensate for higher greenhouse gas emissions. And these 2 options are climate neutral. You see that the more productive agroecological farm at 0.8 livestock unit per hectare emits greenhouse gas, but 4 times less than the conventional farm. So this was for the impacts. For the services, we decided to use a method that is quite simple. We relate to these matrices of land use. So on each line, you have different land use. On each column, you have a number of indicators of ecosystem integrity, and you have a number of regulating and provisioning and cultural services. And for each cell, you have just a note going from 0, no services provided, to 5, which is the best score you can obtain. This is simple, so, and you can use it everywhere. The limit is that it does not account to land management. If your grassland is used well, or if it's if you put too many animals on the lands, you will have the same score. It does not account to management. And I just mentioned here 3 ecosystem services. We could calculate many more. And you see that water purification benefits from the presence of permanent grassland and trees. So it's the highest in the agricultural rewilding farm, and it's at 0 in the conventional farm. And you see also that while the agricultural rewilding, Paysan de Nature, and agroecological farms differ greatly in their carbon storage, they differ only little in landscape aesthetic and biodiversity scores, and all this is related to the presence of permanent grassland. So this is how we can summarize these 5 farms, and the 5 dimensions we already mentioned: human edible protein, water purification, landscape aesthetic, biodiversity, and net climate change. So now the question is, which option represents the best compromise? And to answer this question, we applied an ecosystem multifunctionality method that was proposed by Peter Manning in this article. And doing this requires 2 things. It requires to have functional relationship between the supply of each ecosystem service and the benefits it provides to humans. And you see that there are not only values, but there are also sometimes it's a direct relationship, and sometimes you have forms of relationship. It's also the shape that matters. And you also have to weigh the different services for their relative importance to different stakeholder groups. So this is the weighing we used. The three stakeholder types related to ecosystem sector, environmental agency, and farmers are data that were proposed by Peter Manning in this paper. And we ask colleagues who are working in animal science and in environmental science, how they would weight these 5 different dimensions, and you see the results. On average, they gave a 1/3 weight to production, and then you have the different weighing, biodiversity coming first before carbon sequestration, and aesthetic and water purification. And if you apply this to the performance of these farms, these are the ranking. And you see that, for instance, in this survey, those who give the lowest weight to production, this was assumed for the ecotourism sector and environmental agency, they will have a strong preference to the most extensive options and reject the conventional farm. Farmers who were supposed to have an average weight of 70% for production favor the conventional system, would favor the conventional farm and reject the 2 most extensive options. And with the researcher relative weighing, you see that agricultural rewilding and agroecological farms come first. So the idea is really how you weight the different dimension will lead to different ranking. But of course, it's not that simple. There is variability in stakeholder weighing. I mentioned that 60 researchers answered our question. The average weight for protein production was 32%, but it ranged between 5 and 80%. And it's the same. Farmers do not all think the same. This is an example of a paper that was published by colleagues working in the French uplands, where we produce PDO cheese, and they reported 4 coexistence models in the farmer narratives. So why and how to account for this diversity of stakeholder narratives, and especially of farmer narratives? First, because farmers have made decisions that have clear impact on the land. And we are deeply convinced that accounting for farmer narratives aims to engage into a constructive dialogue about how to move towards environmental targets. And we need to understand that there are different narratives and to account for this pluralism. On the how, now we have frameworks that have been developed, for instance, the nature future frameworks that really help to account for these different narratives. The nature futures frameworks accounts not only for the intrinsic value of nature, which is called nature for nature, but also for its cultural value, its relational value, and also for its instrumental value, that it's broadly what we call regulating services. And a number of researchers have also recently highlighted the need not only to account for the positive dimensions, but also for the negatives. And to do this, Vincent Oostvogel, who's doing his PhD now in the Netherlands, has proposed a framework where he represents both the positive and the narratives. And we use this framework within one of our innovation hub in the Massif Central. The name of this innovation hub is Coccinelle. And we found 4 contrasting narratives among dairy farmers. The first one is represented this way. It's farming with biodiversity. And farmers portray themselves and portray their way of working as harmoniously integrated with biodiversity. They state that biodiversity is a functional foundation of a production system, that their approach naturally preserves biodiversity, and that biodiversity is of profound personal importance to them. That's why the 3 dimensions, intrinsic, instrumental, and cultural, have high score, and the positive score, are higher than the negatives. Some of these farmers also farm from biodiversity, which means that they focus on the instrumental dimensions. And indeed, there are two subtypes: farmers who value what is in their environment, especially the permanent pasture, which are really species rich. And there are also innovative farmers that mainly modify their farming system to increase agrobiodiversity by combining permanent pasture, temporary pasture, hedgerows, trees, fodder crops, and so on. They perceive the positives are more important than the negatives. But there are also farmers who farm separate from biodiversity. You see that they can have a positive, interesting perception of biodiversity, and they consider that intensifying their system leaves space for nature. And again, we see this sustainable intensification way of thinking that I presented earlier. And these farmers say that extensifying agriculture is socially not acceptable because they refer to some type of modern farming, to food security, and so on. It's something that you frequently also hear in the news and in the dominant trade-off. And doing this, they are in conflict with culture, which is why it's represented this way. So 4 types of narratives in this innovation hub dairy farmers, and you see we surveyed 15 farmers, and you see the relative importance of the different narratives, and you see that some farmers also combine 2 types of narratives. We did the same time in another area of French Massif Central, in another PDO area. You see that the relative abundance is not exactly the same, but the same type of narratives appear. And we did the same thing in the Netherlands, in lowlands. And you see that the balance is clearly more different, and that a new type of narrative appear with farmers farming for biodiversity. And in this case, biodiversity can become a priority compared with milk production. So my take-home message related to the last part of my talk is that we need for a more pluralistic perspective of multifunctionality and of biodiversity that accounts for farmers' values, to establish a constructive dialogue about how to move towards environmental targets. You see on the slide a report from IPBES, and you see that accounting for the diverse values of nature is really a hot topic also for IPBES. And also, if this is more related to the first part of my talk, that monocriteria assessment only reveal a small part of a story when analyzing sustainable options for the future of animal production system. Of course, reducing greenhouse gas emission is undeniably important, but we need to avoid to have such a carbon tunnel vision, and also to account for multiple dimensions. That's why we are interested in this multi-criteria evaluation of farming system. And I'm grateful for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. There are already a few questions in the chat. We will keep them until after the presentation of Sebastian and then combine them. Meanwhile, Bertrand, maybe you can have a look on them already. Moving then to our next speaker, Sebastian Lakner. Professor Sebastian Lakner is Professor of Agricultural Economics at the University of Rostock in Germany, with an interest in economic analyses in organic agriculture and in the consequences of the common agricultural policy for greening European agriculture. Sebastian, we're looking forward to your presentation.
Yes, thank you, Walter, for the introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to all of you. My background, as Walter has mentioned, is I'm an agricultural economist. We also do a lot of socioeconomic research at University of Rostock, also in the Agroecology Transect project. And I will switch out a little bit or move out and try to have a broader perspective, taking the experience in extensive grassland in Germany, and trying to make the point that we need animal husbandry for nature conservation. It's more the question how, and this has nicely been pointed out by Bertrand. I guess both of our presentation will give probably the same story, but I will I'm rather coming from a political and economic standpoint. So what the main motivations for this? And this is, first of all, if we look on the situation of permanent grassland, we see there is at least in Germany, there was a sharp decline. We can also observe similar stories in Austria. In Germany, it has been stabilizing. Grassland has been stabilizing since 2014. First of all, by legislations at the federal state level, however, also by greening, but still the question is how this will further develop after the changes we have seen in the CAP in the first half of 2024. So the grassland is declining. Also the farms on grassland, economically, they don't do so well, especially if it comes to extensive grassland. This is from the agricultural report of the federal government. It's a statistic from test farms, 8,000 test farms bookkeeping data. It's the profit plus personal expenditure per person. So basically the value added per person. And if you compare different types of farms, and in the last 2 years, 2022 and 2023, the profits were really skyrocketing high, record profits. However, if you look into the group of suckler cows, sheep, and goats, they have the lowest profits. And this is a constant story. If you look into bookkeeping data, extensive farming does poor with regards to profits. So they have a hard job and they do not earn as much money as other farmers earn. I want to highlight a second point, and this is also the role grassland has played from a historical standpoint. If we go back into the early 20th century, a lot of grassland was used extensive, and there was a lot of extensive grassland use, traditional grassland, a lot of handcraft and low fertilization rates, and if at all, then organic manure, but not no mineral fertilizer, no pesticides. And also the purpose of using grassland was a different one. I'm going to point this out by an example from Bavaria. This is from the Alps. We have those in Germany, Buckelwiesen, but it's a really if you are in the region, visit Mittenwald. It's really a nice biodiversity rich habitat. Litter meadows. So you basically produce litter for your stable, and that in the early 20th century, you would not use straw. You would use straw for other purposes. So you had to produce litter for your stable, and this was done on very poor grassland. So wet, sloping, uneven areas. And nowadays, this is highly biodiversity rich. Even this spot has done an application to UNESCO World Heritage. It points out the importance. And if you do that a little bit more systematic, you can see, and this is very detailed work from a grassland, old grassland scientist. I tried to simplify that a little bit. Alois Kapfer from Bavaria, knowing grassland use very well. And if you look into early 20th century, you had sheep pasture, you had litter meadows, then you had traditional meadows with high hay and silage, and you had paddock pastures. So that was the traditional style, and that with continued structured change, that strongly changed into something where you have little use for fallow land, extensive grassland, nutrient poor grassland. So you do not make a lot of profit with that. Some was already converted into conservation area, and more intensive meadows where you just cut grass, and you have combined pastures, and you have pure pastures. And if you look on recent trends now, part of that fallow land, extensive land, and even conservation areas, they get abandoned, and that converts step by step into forests, which means all the agrobiodiversity is gone. Then you have intensification, homogenization, so mineral fertilizer, pesticides, cutting 3 to 5 times, just a few species who have a high yield. So this is the second trend. Even there, biodiversity gets lost, and you convert parts of those grasslands into arable land where you produce fodder or material for biogas. And those are the 3 trends which are basically putting biodiversity into questions. Now, if we go in the recent past, so the past few years, we also have to look on meat consumption. In the longer term, if you just look on ruminants, there is a decline of ruminants as well. So we lose pasture. Ruminants ruminants are not on the meadow anymore. They are in stable. It's an intensive, stable system. So ruminants are not on the pastures anymore. And there is also a decline in meat consumption. So if you look on the pure figures, and I would like you to focus on the 4 bars on the right-hand side, 2020 to 2023, there is less meat consumption in Germany per capita, kilogram per capita. If you go back on 5 kilogram per person in Germany, this is quite a bit, because that refers to the whole population of 82, 83 million people, and each one of them is eating 5 kilo less. So that is substantial. However, sometimes you see figures of vegan products. I introduced them here. You can see them as red bars. Do you see them? I don't see them because they are still marginal. So just changing that into vegan products, you can do that. I'm fully fine with that. We do that ourselves at home. However, it's still marginal. So question is how this is evolving. And you can also see that the largest decline is in pork meat. Internationally, that is not the trend. The trend is still going up, and especially the emerging economies are increasing their meat consumption. So this will not automatically solve the problem. Just a few points here. I mean, globally, the trend is increasing meat consumption. And so in the short run, just phasing that out is not realistically. And if we reduce production in Germany, it will shift anywhere else. So the question is, again, how do we do animal production, and on which locations and in which systems? And this brings me to the point where animal grazing and conservation can be helpful. Let's have a look on the economics of that. And you see here again the landscape I showed at the very beginning, a traditional landscape, hedges on stony walls. This has been in place in eastern Saxony, in the southeast of Germany, and very biodiversity rich and highly endangered habitats. Let's have a look on a more systematic view on that. You can, and this is coming from ecology, where you simply sort different soils or different types of grassland according to their yield potential. You can say grassland, you can also say arable land, it doesn't matter. Basically, the point is, the more you intensify, first of all, if you're just coming from forest and you start using grassland, biodiversity increases, and then step by step, where production system get more intensive, biodiversity decreases. If you have organic farming system, conventional farming system, and they have two options. They can enhance their yield potential, so get more intensive, or enhance biodiversity. And it's clear where the economic drivers, in which direction economic drivers go. And the question is also, to what degree can we intensify? Is that really good? I would doubt that, but that is what's going on. And on the other hand, we have traditional farms. You still meet them every once in a while. All elderly people who work in a traditional way, they are often enhancing the best biotopes with the highest biodiversity. Now let's move it. Let's introduce economics here. So what we normally do in agricultural policy, we calculate any payment, and this is the basics of agri-environmental schemes. When you calculate the payment rates, you simply think about, well, again, we have the same system here, locations according yield potential, so soil quality, and so on. And these are the costs of farms when they extensify, when they reduce fertilization, cut later in the year, reduce pesticides, and so on. And so what are they losing? And if they are on an extensive, so in a low yield potential situation, they might have opportunity costs of 250 euros. And here the payment is 330. So for this farm, it's interesting economically to participate in an agri-environmental scheme. And if you go into a more yield, in more high yield location, you might experience even 800 euros. This is pretty high. This is the most intensive end of the spectrum. However, here they would lose a lot, so they won't participate at all. And it's pretty easy to see, well, the cutting point is here where the payments are equal to the opportunity costs. So participation, yes, in that direction, no, in that direction. That's the way you calculate payments for agri-environmental scheme. And this is, well, not the whole story. That's not the full picture. I mean, it's important, yes. You will see I will start with, again, if I'm introducing biodiversity, following again the same logic of sorting out locations according yield potential. Again, first of all, in the more intensive landscapes, that's the logic you follow. You look at opportunity costs, and the question is now, on what level do you set it? Do you want to gain some farmers here? Then you need to increase the payment rates. However, you have a second curve, and that is at the very low yield potential locations where you have pretty high biodiversity. And this is keeping landscape open. So avoiding farms or keeping farms away from abandoning their land. Because if you speak to farmers, many farmers, they don't have much interest into this type of locations. And here, sometimes you speak with firms that keep landscape open. So sometimes you have firms that simply do the job. They don't do agriculture, but they are landscape preservation firms. And if you look on their cost structure, even mowing twice could cost you about 400 euros. If you just have low difficulties, and mowing twice, if it's getting more difficult, 500 euros. And if you just have this a hand cutter, really that is tough work. If you've seen that, you cut the grass with hand, it's very steep, very stony, it's difficult. You need to move the material by hand and so on. 1,600 euros, even 2,000, 2,500. And you see that is going far beyond what we pay if we are paying against opportunity costs in intensive grasslands. So you have a second curve, and this is often neglected. And you can also see, if you want to keep landscape open, that is much more costly. So here we have the mountain meadows, and here, let's say, here is intensification of grassland use is the problem, but at the other end of the spectrum, giving up grassland is the kind of enemy we have to avoid it if we want to maintain biodiversity-rich grassland. We can also observe, if we look into the statistics, these type of meadows, they are becoming larger. Here, this is a statistics from our Federal Office of Statistics, grassland ordered according animal density. This is low animal density, so 0, 0.3, 0.5, so very low animal densities. And here, this at the beginning was around 17%, and here that has almost doubled since the year 2000 in the last years. And you see the very intensive end. Well, it has also increased, but not to that degree. So we have a significant 1/3 of the grassland is very extensive, and we might lose some of that if we do not account for that in the costs. How does agricultural policy help here? And this is just a very short glimpse. And interestingly, this was not done by accident that I posted a photo from Norway, a really nice landscape. I could have also posted a photo from Switzerland, because in those countries, they pay pretty high rates for extensive grazing in high mountainous area because they know they will lose that and they need that for agrotourism, for instance. So what does the Common Agricultural Policy offer? And this is work done together with Guy Pierre. And here we can see most of the payments from the Common Agricultural Policy are still into income support, which is not targeted at anything, even not at income of farms. That's completely untargeted, waste of money. Increase competitiveness, rough also, same here. It does not really help competitiveness. It's just a label. And at least 20% for environmental payments. Environment makes 3 objectives of 9. So one has accounted for the importance of environment, and in the longer run, if you look in the longer run, the Common Agricultural Policy has increased their payments. Currently, we spend 26% of the cap payments for environment in the EU, so that's not too bad. However, and that's the second part of the story, it's not very well targeted. You can make this point easily looking at the last funding period where we spent most of the money to greening. It's the first row, so roughly 800 euros per hectare. Agro-environmental and climate measures in the second pillar, much more effective, 250 euros per hectare, so much lower end. The most effective part, supporting Natura 2000, 25 euros per hectare. And that is poor. That is, we spend most of the money to the least effective purposes. And that is still a structural problem. And that will get even worse with the nature restoration law. If we want to implement it, we need to spend the money into things that work, and not waste our money for income, competitiveness, or things like greening. So how can we measure effectiveness? And this is something we did at Thunen Institute. So here you see the opposite of effectiveness. I hope some of you might have a small grin, because I mean, if you introduce those boxes, nesting boxes for birds, I mean, this is just payment optimization that will not save the biodiversity of birds in Hungary. However, how can we measure that? And we try to do for Germany by categorization of having the very simple measures, light green programs, simple requirement, low payments, dark green programs, so very complex payments, and organic farming doesn't fit to both categories. So we did a third category, organic farming. What you can see in the two previous funding periods, that the dark green in the second pillar, in the agri-environmental and climate measures in the second pillar, that almost doubled, and that is a good sign. You can also show that the objective biodiversity plays a much more prominent role in the second pillar scheme. So that is the right direction to go. However, we still have a lot of light green programs, so there's a lot of potential here to improve. Now I'm moving to a specific case, the Natura 2000 plots in Saxony, and this is lowland meadows. You might know this typology of the habitat directives. So 6,510, 6,520, those are were the type of habitats we were investigating. And the objective in the management plans is to cut late in end of June, which is, yeah, has a lot of practical problems. So the first practical problem is that you cannot really use that as forage. You can just use that as litter. So this is basically going back into the early 20th century. And this is hard to communicate to farms. So you will need to pay them well. The yield potential of those meadows is low. Again, those are the type of meadows we can potentially lose. And areas are often very far away from stable or from the farm, so this is also making life difficult. For biodiversity, there is little fine-tuning. So if you look into the agri-environmental measures in Saxony, there's one good example where we fine-tuned measures for one butterfly species, so that makes a lot of sense. However, the largest part of the agri-environmental schemes in Germany are not too much targeted on on the objectives of Natura 2000. They might help, probably, but the fine-tuning is not there. You need to have local fine-tuning on those species. So what we did is we analyzed a number of farms in Saxony, and they are marked in red. So you see, we also went through the whole, not the eastern part, the western part of Saxony, but those are all plots of Natura 2000s. We collected data there over a longer time period in the 2000s until 2011. So it's also a little bit older. However, it helped us to identify the effects on agricultural policy. So we asked farmers, are you willing to accept the optimal Natura 2000 measure in the management plan, or are you willing to accept the compromise variant, which is not exactly optimal, however, still helping for some of the species? And we identified a number of factors influencing this decision, and we try to guess or to estimate the statistical effect of those measures. I will focus just on the policy tools we have, and you can see in the lower part exactly those three categories I mentioned. So dark green agri-environmental measures, light green agri-environmental measures, and organic farming. And interestingly, dark green measures, they strongly increase the probability that farmers are willing to accept that. There is, well, causality here is not completely straightforward. Often those farms, but not always. So just a share of the farms were already using those measures. And when you confront them with an optimized management plan, then they are willing and they have already understood what's the problem is. Light green measures, they help just for compromise variant. Interestingly, organic farming also helps, but organic farming is also sometimes difficult to implement that. Okay, let's also switch to a second part of the statistics.
Which time?
Second part to the statistics. And this is, if you look on those plots, grazing is roughly 40% of those plots, and that is important. It's not about just having the pure conservation part. On some of those plots, you just can find a solution if you have grazing regimes or combined mowing and grazing. And this is also important because sometimes conservationists tend to be very ideological on that. Okay, let's go to the discussion. A few points I want to make. If we want to enhance support here, motivations are important. So we need to reduce bureaucracy. We need to have more, we have to have better incentives to take into account. They might abandon land, and we often just focus on farm levels. We need to have planning and coordination at the landscape level. So current instruments, and that is already at the lower part of the slide, the current instruments do not solve the problem fully. So we also need new funding systems, new methods of funding. We also have a number of economic aspects and market aspects. So we will not save all the grassland plots without considering some extensive livestock grazing systems. So without this, we will not have open landscapes. Economically, this is only for the farms, only feasible also if they can have diversification, so gaining money from other sources. And we will, and this is also a contradiction, if we enhance and increase agri-environmental funding in those regions, we will keep some of those low competitiveness farm. And this is from pure economic standpoint. So we keep farms with a low profit alive. And that means we inhibit structural change, which is taking place everywhere. And this is something we have to be aware that this is not without problems. Creation for a market for conservation might really help. So having high-priced marketing, landscape conservation meat, we can have direct marketing, agritourism. We all have that in those areas. So I'm not telling anything new. This is already practiced in Austria, Switzerland, and some German plots. So nothing completely new. The last point, certification could be a role. This is an example from Germany where we implement that. If you want to do some reading, there are some suggestions also where I put my statistics from. And coming back to the extensive landscapes of Saxony, this is a stone wall, traditional agriculture, and this is also a case study which we can only keep alive if we have grazing systems. So thanks for your attention. I'm looking forward for discussion.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Well, the floor is now open for questions, and a number have already appeared in the chat. I suggest, because most of those at the moment still pertain to Bertrand's presentation, that we take the informative questions on Bertrand's presentation first. And there are a number of elements that come to the fore. The carbon storage, how you calculate it, what assumptions there are about longevity of the carbon pools. Application to Mediterranean areas is one of the questions. So possibilities for extrapolation or not, or new studies. And a final question that I would like to pass to Guy, if you will, Guy, is about coupling of policy measures. Maybe you can look up that question of João Palma in the chat. Bertrand, can I give the floor first to you for those
thanks
questions?
for the question and for the nice comments in the chat. So I can say a little bit more on the methodologies. Because of course, how you calculate carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas emission will have a direct and strong impact on the results. I've been working on that I'm lucky to have colleagues who are really good in LCA, who are Ayo van der Werf and Michael Corson. And if you know LCA, you know that they have expertise on that. Just I would like to say that, for instance, we accounted for pasture age in to estimate the carbon potential, the potential of carbon sequestration. Of course, relatively young pasture permanent pasture sequestrate more carbon, and then carbon sequestration decrease with age. And we indeed had 4 classes of age based on a collective scientific assessment that was led by Sylvain Pellerin for Atlantic areas and for temperate areas. So we went to the farms and we saw how old are the different pasture, and we applied the right values to the right pasture. Also for the trees, they don't grow in just one night. So we had an hypothesis stating that the relative proportion between root biomass and biomass in above ground biomass is relatively simple, and we accounted for the time trees need to grow. For methane emission, we used IPCC data. I've seen that there's a question. I cannot answer directly this question on whether we use the last thing, but really our idea was really to specify the order of magnitude of what can be compensated from the methane emissions by carbon sequestration in the soil and in woody biomass. So take it like this, because I think I'm an advocate of grassland-based system. I've something been told that I belong to the meat lobby, but we have to be serious. Grassland do not compensate for everything. You see that the full compensation is for this lowland area around 0.5 livestock units per hectare. Everything is not compensated, but we also have to account for the fact that grassland-based systems are not only about producing meat and milk and carbon sequestration. There's biodiversity and all the other variables that have to be considered. And of course, process will differ according to the climatic zone. I like the question on the Mediterranean areas. I don't have this data myself, but typically I would suggest that the same type of measurements should be made in Mediterranean areas, in boreal areas, because of course the soil process will differ according to soil moisture and so on. And we need to provide reference to be serious in this debate. I think I globally answer the methodology question, and maybe we can leave the floor to Guy for how multi-performance is accounted in public policy.
Yes, thanks for directing the question to me, and thanks also, João, for a very important question on multifunctionality and multi-criteria for looking into the system. Indeed, if we're looking at agricultural areas, then obviously, as Sebastian was also presenting, the Common Agricultural Policy is the dominant policy, but we need to remember that even the CAP has 9 objectives, and it also is the instrument to implement the Water Framework Directive, to implement the nature directives, namely the habitat directives, bird directives, and others. And so when we're talking about multi-criteria, we need to think multi-criteria. And the first thing is, even within the CAP, that we're currently missing instruments for diversification. And I'm talking about landscape diversification, I'm talking about income diversification, but also for restoration, for instance, hedges or landscape features, which are important also in grazing systems. If you look currently in the CAP, actually there's an exemption from restoring or maintaining landscape features in grassland areas, which doesn't actually make any sense. So obviously, sheep and cows also need shade, for instance, in very hot days. And so the issue is really to think about the multiple criteria that affect a sustainable agricultural system. And that means looking into the economics of who needs help to do what, looking into the social dimension of how to make sure that there is a market for these products, that people buy these right products of extensive and understand why they're supporting also those farmers doing the right thing. And then finally, of course, looking into the environmental measures and not through the tunnel vision of carbon storage and sequestration. So there was a question also about carbon storage versus sequestration, which is very important. making sure that large trees remain there, making sure we don't remove shrubs. Scrublands actually are incredibly important for biodiversity and often forgotten or removed. Even in the beautiful picture that Sebastian was showing earlier, you see trees and you see grass. There are no scrubs. They're cleaned up. So thinking multi-criteria really needs this heterogeneity and understanding of the benefits from extensive grazing, also for water purification, making sure that there's no leaks, etc. And from a policy perspective, now that the nature restoration law is approved, we really need to make sure that the CAP is coherent with the nature restoration law. And we need to also put a lot of pressure to see very soon, hopefully, the sustainable framework, sustainable food systems framework, which was prepared by the Commission but not published. And von der Leyen did not make any statement of whether this is going to come up soon or not. And I hope it should, because otherwise we will not be able to address both the production side, which the CAP is addressing, and the consumption side of how do we deliver food which is healthy, balanced, etc., to those that need it in reasonable prices as well.
Thank you, Guy. Yeah, a very important question of how to keep all of those lines and dimensions together once you arrive at in the arena of policy design. And I think your answer, Guy, is one of very much of vigilance of possible gaps in taking certain dimensions into account, and that is a big challenge. Because you need so many different disciplines and so much attention for the Brussels microcosm, let's say, that has such a huge impact on all of us. And I wonder if there are sufficient people that find it in their role to keep that. So would be interested to hear a little bit more about that from the audience, maybe. Okay, before that aspect, if it comes back, a question to Sebastian about the role of CAP on the one hand side, and then what the member states make of it in relation to your bird box subsidy harvesting slide. Could you go into that question of João Palma, please?
Yes, indeed. And first of all, the bird box, I guess, Guy, that was from your 2014 paper, right? If I remember correctly. I mean, that's an absurd example. So kind of an extreme example. And that is exactly right. I mean, the member states in the current CAP have a crucial role. They can design their strategic plans with a lot of degrees of freedom. So they need to point out where are the deficits, where are the demands, and how they address those demands in the member states. And this is kind of I'm not going into the complex design of strategic plans, but it's completely right. The member states, they have the freedom to design that. And I already posted into, if you look on the question of Joao, thanks. I already posted a current report from the Court of Auditors. The Court of Auditors is in Luxembourg. It's one, it controls the budget use in the EU. So they, every once in a while, they look on the agricultural budget, and they are very critical. And you can also see from this current report of 2024 that the member states, I mean, the Commission is outlining some targets. They say they have a rough idea of how ambitious a strategic plan should be. And what you can see from the report from the Court of Auditors is that the Commission made a huge number of comments when the first strategic plans were introduced in 2022. So they made a long list of comments, and only a share of them was really addressed. The member states ignored a significant part of those comments. So basically, this new implementation models where the Commission gives a lot of power to the member states do hardly whatever they want. However, if you look into the pure mechanics of the CAP, you have many opportunities. You could use a significant share, even beyond 50%, you could use for environmental purposes. So you can do ambitious policies. We've written a paper. I can post it where we highlight the potential in terms of environment. However, the ball is in the area of the member states. And thanks for the point. It's important.
Yeah, thank you, Sebastian. That in fact brings a lot of the discussion that's going on about Brussels being far away for many of us and invisible or not very accessible, brings it back to much more, let's say, visible dimensions as being taken care of within member state negotiations, let's say. Brings me to a question that Fabian Stark asked, making the link to Bertrand's tool on the role of placating the various ecosystem services. And if we're now at the member state level, suppose we are actionable, what role for this tool could be there?
So, are you asking me, or are you asking the question?
Okay. Yes.
Okay. So from I understood the question by Fabian on how to deal. I showed that different stakeholder groups do not have the same perspective. And that even within a stakeholder group, they don't all think the same. And it brings us to, and behind all this, there are trade-offs we have to deal with, because if you increase production, you will decrease other things. This is what I try to show. On how to put this in debate, this is really at the core of Agroecology Transect project, because as Walter reported, we have 11 innovation hubs, and in these 11 innovation hubs, we have multi-actor groups. So we have meetings where people do not think the same, do not have the same priority. What we do in the French Innovation Hub is that we try to develop serious games, because the fact that you are bringing people together and that you ask them to play a game is put them in another posture. You ask them to build something together rather than just saying what they think about the future of dairy farming in upland areas. And especially we have developed a game in which we represent a system and its interaction along different interfaces, the market, the jobs, the external inputs, various environmental issues, and also the social aspects. And we ask people to build together a representation of their system and to agree on that. So there are some rules to make the game going on, even if they don't feel the same. And then we change something in the for instance, we say we would like to produce more cheese and less milk, or we would like to reduce the importance of inputs that come from outside the system. And we show them by doing this that if you change something in a complex system, it will affect all the other dimensions. So for us, really developing games is a way to make people interact by asking them to build something. So this is how we do it at a local level. But I understood that you also wanted to discuss this question on how people negotiate at a broader level. And this could be more a question for Guy and Sebastian.
Exactly. Sebastian, you just said, well, it's a very complex matter how these national negotiations take place. Could you nevertheless, having arrived at that point, open up that black box for us a little bit, and then maybe Guy can add to that where he sees fit, and maybe also keep in the back of your mind, you know, this such a multi-criteria almost negotiation play or tool where you shift weights. To what extent would such a kind of scientific input play a role, or is this purely a power game, let's say?
Yeah, I'm having a hard time, let's say, not saying that it's largely a power game. I mean, maybe first of all on the structure, and this is even more complex in Germany because agriculture policy is to the federal states. They are in charge of that. So they need to have a say against the national government. So we have 13 federal state governments, again, together with the central government developing this strategic plan. You have different parties involved in that. And in Germany, in the federal states, some years ago, the Green still played a role. So this German strategic plan was basically a compromise between the conservative Christian Unions or CDU, Conservative Party, the European People's Party, and the Green in some of the federal states. And this is the German compromise. From nowadays perspective is not too bad. There is still many things to improve, and a current example is that we had many stakeholders demanding for more grassland support in the eco schemes. And when I say grassland support, it's it's simple grassland support. It's not the Natura 2000 stuff we have been discussing in the first presentation, but still, you need to have grazing systems supported. And science asked for that. Many environmental NGOs were in favor of that. Even the Farmers Association, which play a very strange role in agriculture policy, avoiding everything which goes into environment. However, even they agreed to that, but still said, but not at the cost of direct payments. And that's the issue. It's about balancing that out. For what purpose do we spend money? And of course, then finally, our government said, yeah, we won't cut the direct payments for farmers. They are so poor. I mean, had record high profits, however, they are poor, and we won't cut off the direct payments, and that's why we will not have such a eco scheme going into grazing systems. So it's a power game, basically. So the issue is having the voice of scientists louder, include us in the political debate. I'm trying to do that every once in a while. But at the end of the day, it's also a matter of election results. If agriculture and if environmental issues are not at all a topic for environment, you've seen the floods in Austria and the Green Party has lost 5%. Well, then you don't get environment into government and into strategic plan. It's as simple as that. Sorry.
Guy.
Yeah, I would like to try to divide my answer in a complementary way and trying to stay also more positive on the potentials of what we can do, because it is very frustrating and there is a power game. But I divided my answer into two parts. One is to explain the complexity that maybe not all people listening to this seminar might be aware of. And this is the complexity of the multi-scale level of how the CAP negotiations are going on. So on the one hand, there are the member states and they have the council represented in the what you call the trilogue discussions. Then you have the parliament and then you have the commission. Seemingly, the commission is the one putting a proposal of how the CAP should be, and then they are not as much participating in the dialogue or actually trilogue negotiations, but practically they are very active in it. So we're talking about von der Leyen. Until now, it's Wojciechowski. But we've seen that von der Leyen was extremely active as well. And then the parliament is changing every 5 years, and the elections mean that now it's even more right-centered and extreme right-centered. So there's political pressure from completely other directions, like the war in Ukraine, like immigrants at all, etc. So the environment is pushed to the side, and that is a big problem for now on. That the Green Deal is being pushed to the side, and instead we see more competitiveness and exactly those kind of payments that don't help also the farmers. We've seen that the farm demonstrations were getting a lot of media attention, even though it was a very small minority and very extreme minority of the farmers that were demonstrating. But there was an interest from the political side to receive them and to use them for a U-turn on the Green Deal. And that makes the current conditions very difficult. We currently have the canceling of environmental standards that we need in the CAP, and actually for our own safety, also for food safety, etc. So this is putting a very difficult situation for anybody thinking, okay, how can I influence that given the complexity of member states pushing the EU to generate enough flexibility in order to do nothing? And then they have enough flexibility to be very ambitious, but practically they also have the flexibility of doing very little. But here there are two opportunities, in my opinion, and that's where the positive part comes. First of all, if the EU is handing the freedom for member states to do anything, and they can be also a lot more ambitious. We are now on a seminar on, or a webinar on grazing areas and livestock. One opportunity is to use the flexibility that exists and to demand for member states to use this flexibility for defining grasslands correctly. There is the opportunity to define wood pastures, which is not done in Austria, for instance, to define scrublands as grasslands as well, which is necessary for the value of these pastures, for biodiversity, for cows, they need this shade, etc. So pressing on member states to actually use the flexibility correctly and use the opportunity they have in the definitions, and making sure that there are eco schemes, that there are agro-environmental schemes also for restoration, also for extensification. Member states do have the opportunity to put the money to that if they decide to do that. And that is available even now. If they decide to do it next year, they can do it. The CAP does not prohibit that. And we need to be aware of that this flexibility could be used if there's enough pressure also from people, from scientists. The second thing that I think is very positive is the consensus we have among both scientists and society on what is really important for us in order to survive into the current polycrisis. We have climate change, biodiversity loss, land degradation, economic crisis, etc. And there is also the awareness that nature is part of the solution and not part of the problem. So the pressure on the nature restoration law has resulted in very courageous voting in some governments, even if losing 5% in the votes, which I don't think it was because of the voting. But still, there was a support from the science, from the community of different NGOs and other organizations working together to make nature restoration law happen. And it is a game changer in the sense that the nature restoration law and the CAP together can make a difference to what is going to happen in the future. Because member states have to deliver, it's a law. And they have to use the instruments they have, which means that, well, we can put a bit more pressure on demanding what we know from science that can work. So complexity does not mean we don't know. And I think this is a place where we need to be honest brokers on the different lanes of achieving more with the current tools we have.
A very vocal plea for scientific input on specific topics. Sebastian, with the response, and then we will move to the very last question by William Waterfield.
Yeah, just a small side remark. I mean, as a scientist, I'm not arguing for one or the other party. That this is something I wanted to clarify still. I mean, this is not the Austrian case is important, Guy. I mean, they lost 5%. They got out of the government, and this was the final vote which was decisive to get the nature restoration law accepted. So election results matter. And even if it's not the Green Party, there could be other parties. I don't care which party, but which of the other parties have environment, biodiversity, and climate in their program. I mean, it's a general trend. I don't mind if the European People's Party are solving our environmental problems. However, they don't do so, and that's the bad message. So that was the first part. Second part, and this refers to our Agroecology Transect project. I guess what is also crucial is to have funding schemes and investments into, let's say, multi-dimensional farming systems. So having, for instance, investment funds for installing agroforestry or tree lines or things like that. So having those, what we have as innovation hubs, and they are very interesting systems to get innovative in terms of the environmental dimension, but also in the social dimension. So we need to support those innovative farming systems which we have in our project. So the evidence here is here, the examples are here, and the message is have a look on that and try to think how we can support those systems. I guess that is also a second message which I want to point out from my part.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. That's very much not only about technology, but also about the network aspect of this anchoring, and then finally of the institutions that support ultimately through policies this anchoring of the innovation hubs. Now we have more very interesting questions in the chat, but we need to move to an end. I'm afraid. I promised the last question to be from William Waterfield, where I think the question is about developers compensating for the loss of biodiversity versus a lack of sufficient financial support for farmers. So if I understand well, William, you are saying, well, let's have society pay through the development in agricultural areas. And that might be a question to our economist, pure Sebastian, about these communicating vessels of, building houses to compensate ultimately farmers for better nature management.
With regards to climate, that might work. I mean, maybe Bertrand, you can join me into this question if you have an idea. However, my feelings is that, I mean, just this Monday we published a big kind of IPBES report for Germany on biodiversity, and the main message was also, well, it's so complex. So we, for a good policy, we would need to, let's say, have a measure if we want to do it through a policy, through markets. That's a big opportunity. We just try to define certification measures. Okay, that's not so straightforward, but there are. I listed one example, and then we try to implement that on the market. And I guess for the market, I see a lot of potential, but we need to go into that direction. Bertrand, what are your thoughts on that?
I would just like to add also that, because I've seen the different question we will not have to answer, that really also to explain that in Agroecology Transect, we analyze barriers and levers and opportunities to move towards more agroecological system. And again, we embrace this complexity as we are already investigating. We are making type of levers or barriers. And we see that, of course, market is part of it, knowledge is part of it. That's why I try to bring in this debate, the idea that we also need to provide data about the multi-performance of various systems. And of course, in the multi-performance overall, I've focused on services and impacts. We also have to account for the economic performance, because farmers need to live for their work. We can define the right level of subsidies that any system could deserve, but I'm sure that farmers want also to make at least part of their money from the products they sell. And so we try to account for these different dimensions. We have our politics, market, infrastructure, which can be sometimes lacking, especially in some areas. We start to lack vets, we lack slaughterhouse. So how can you maintain a system in this area if you lose the infrastructure? Access to land can be very important. Knowledge. I was very also giving opportunities to young people to join. We had a workshop in Guadeloupe, which is one of our innovation hub, and they consider that really the fact that new farmers can enter the system is really crucial in their condition. And I'm sure it's not only the case in Guadeloupe. So we try to embrace this complexity when analyzing the barriers and the opportunities for niche system to enter the dominant system, to reach the more mainstream system. And I guess we will provide further webinars on this question of barriers and lever, because we are now working at least on a collective paper, and so we will present it one day within the webinars.
Right. And that look to the future, I would like to end with and announce briefly the two upcoming webinars before handing back to Chilak. On the 31st of October, Jeroen Groot and Shima Sajadi Jajarm will present the results of their analysis of options for scaling out. And they will show patterns of hotspots and cold spots in Europe that emerge when we extrapolate the characteristics of exemplary agroecology initiatives that we surveyed. And on 29 November then, Kian Blacks will present the results of a meta-analysis that he has been doing together with colleagues in Agroecology Transect on the effects of agroecological practices on climate change and biodiversity. So the evidence that is present in scientific papers about agroecological practices and climate change and biodiversity. So hope to see you all there, and check out the website. There's lots of messages on this from Chilak in the chat. And with that, back to Chilak or Anna.
Yes. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of our presenters and speakers. Thank you, Bertrand and Sebastian, and also Guy, for your valuable input during the discussion. And thank you, Walter, for moderating the questions as well. So I hope I will close the session now, as we're a little bit over time. But it was very nice to see all of you here, and hope to see you at our next webinar, which is the link to which can be found in the chat. So please register if you can make it on the 31st of October. So thank you, everyone, and thank you to all the speakers as well, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Good.